I remember when I wrote about it in a article for a journal, the editor sent it back saying that, can you just check your numbers? They don't seem to be right. And that is absolutely, I can completely understand the editor's reaction, because we don't know of any mental health intervention for suicide which reduces suicide rates by 60%.
In recent years, there have been a lot of studies which have been exploring this link between income and mental health, especially to do with depression and suicide. Can you explain this link to me in brief, and also what these studies are saying?
Studies show there are now at least two or three studies from different parts of the world, mostly from low and middle income countries. So they're not from high income countries. The first and most well known study which came out recently was a study from Brazil. Now, Brazil in 2003 implemented a cash transfer program. It's called a conditional cash transfer program only because there are some conditions attached to it. They've kept very good data for it from 2003. So some researchers went back and looked at that entire database, and about 100 million Brazilians, which is almost half of the population, have received these cash transfers at various times. And they looked at this entire sample of 100 million people from 2004 to 2015, which is close to about 12 years of data. And what they found was very interesting, that among the people who had got the cash transfer compared to their peers who hadn't got the cash transfer, suicide rates among those people who had got the cash transfer was 60% lower than the others. I remember when I wrote about it in a article for a journal, the editor sent it back saying that, can you just check your numbers? They don't seem to be right. And that is absolutely, I can completely understand the editor's reaction, because we don't know of any mental health intervention for suicide which reduces suicide rates by 60%. And here is an intervention which, with a very large sample over a long period of time, showing that suicide rates were down by 60%. So clearly, cash transfers, or the idea that people should not be living in poverty, seems to not only help with the poverty, education, health, and all of these things, but actually does also help to reduce suicides.
Since you mentioned these are all middle and lower income countries, this data comes from. So, do you think it can be extrapolated to India as well, since we kind of fall in that category?
I think so. I think we should try it out in India. So these are countries with very similar economic state of growth. And so why should it not work in India? I mean, there's enough evidence now from many large such studies to show that it may have an impact. And I think, given the high rates of suicide in India, Indians only make up 1/6 or 1/7 of the world population, but we account for close to 1/3 of the world's suicides. So our suicide rates are remarkably and high as compared to the rest of the world. So there's no reason to suspect it won't work, but we won't know unless we do it. What I mean by demography is who dies by suicide in India. Our demography is very different to the demography of suicides across the world, especially in the Western world. Just to give you some examples, in the West, almost 80% or 90% of people who die of suicide will have a history of a clinical depression. That's quite well known. In India, for example, that number is much lower. It's somewhere between 40 and 50%. So it's not 80 and 90% as it is in the Western world. In the West, a lot of the suicides will peak among the older populations, of people above 50 and 60. India's suicide peaks. We do have a peak also at 60. But more importantly, we have a big peak among the young people, among the 18 to 39-year-olds. In fact, in that age group of 18 to 39, which is the most productive section of our population, suicide is the number one cause of death for women of that age. and the number 2 cause of death for men of that age. So, our demography is quite different to the suicide demography in the West. And so, what we need interventions which are designed to address our suicide demography. The interventions need to be targeted at specific groups differently. So, what you want to do to reduce suicide, say, among the 14 and 15-year-olds, might require an intervention in the education system. And if you want to reduce suicides in the 40-year-olds, maybe you need to start addressing unemployment. And if you want to reduce suicides among young women, especially married young women, then you need to start looking at something which will reduce domestic violence. So these are interventions which need to be then targeted at specific subgroups to get that benefit.
Studies like this, do you think they could kind of drive policies in India when it comes to minimum wage?
There are some studies on minimum wage and its impact on mental health from a few countries. Most of these studies tend to be naturalistic experiments, where countries have implemented something and then someone's gone and done research on it. So the one which people are well aware of is the study from UK, because UK in about 2000, in 1999, increase their minimum wage to what they call a living wage, and so some researchers went and looked at that data, and what you found was that people who had received the minimum wage, as opposed to people who did not receive that increased minimum wage, uh, had almost a 47% less risk of having depressive symptoms, and even more importantly, the effect on depressive symptoms was about a standard deviation of 0.35 or something, 37. And just to put this into context, the standard deviation when you treat people with antidepressants, which means a reduction in depressive symptoms with antidepressants, is about 0.39. So, the minimum wage had about as much effect on depressive symptoms among that population, especially low wage population, as giving out antidepressants would. So clearly, we need to start thinking of these as actually treatment intervention, as health treatment or mental health treatment interventions, and not just as social intervention. The bottom line of all of this, as I see it, is that anything that reduces poverty, anything that allows people to live a life and participate fully in society, uh, is likely to have a significant impact on mental health symptoms, whether they are depression, anxiety, or even things like suicide. So, countries like India, which are poor in that sense, especially in human resources, really do need to invest in these kind of preventative, broad public policy social solutions, because we would then reduce the burden on our healthcare services, which are anyway uh, suffering from understaffing, under resourced in many sorts of ways.